I came across this title of this thing for two reasons. The first was that 2 years ago I presented a paper on the judgment of Arendt, representing the other opinions in a space relationship. So where are we judging today when we think in the way of Hannah Arendt, the enlarged mentality? We should also use this as an international judgment, changing our point of view, not as Europeans, but on an imaginary point of global citizens to judge about what happens in the world. So this was the end of my paper 2 years ago, and I was thinking on, and I came across by chance this book of Zhao Tingyang, All Under Heaven, which comes to Surkamp. So it's, I think now, the entrance of Chinese thinkers not as objects for Europeans in Asian studies or something like this specialized, but being partners of international philosophical political discussions. He's presenting some new world order, and I thought this can be contrasted with Arendt's point of view. And the second reason is the contemporary conflicts of power politics with new autocratic regimes, populist movements, and the crisis of traditional liberalism. So there's some need to talk about how will we go on with world politics. And Hannah Arendt serves not only as somebody who has another international concept, but also when we can say she belongs to Republicanist thinking and theories. So how could it be to introduce Hannah Arendt as a Republicanist alternative to empire thinking or all under heaven thinking, and as an alternative to liberalism, which is well known already with Hannah Arendt? So in the following, I will present the concept of a new world order of all under heaven by the Chinese philosopher Zhao Tingyang, which has been positively received in the West and confronted with Arendt's alternative view of being in the world. It is about the indispensable question of the institutions of any world order. This is federalism in Arendt's case and the strange absence of institutions in Zhao's case. Secondly, I would like to present the attractiveness, especially in China, of alternatives to the official Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, as well as to liberalism in the form of authoritarian theories, such as those of Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, and at the same time of Confucian democratic ideas of a meritocratically organized society. Both currents are more stronger than any proposal of republicanism. And even if we decide us for democratic Confucianism, because we have to respect traditional cultural values and habits, and this is a democratic alternative, we will face the conflict between strong ethics dominating society and politics and the clear alternative of Arendt's position: strong politics instead of strong ethical behavior, and strong controversy of opinions instead of strong conformism. So I start with a short characterization of what is all under heaven, Tianxia. The world order of Tianxia, presented by the philosopher Zhao, was particularly common in the Zhou dynasty in the 11th to 3rd century before our time. According to this order, heaven had given the king the mandate to rule over all that was under heaven. This is all of China. Tianxia resembles the Orbis Terrarum in Roman antiquity. After China's turn to the European idea and practice of nation-states in the 19th and 20th century, and the suppression of Confucianism by the Chinese Communist Party in mainland China from 1949 to 89, the concept of Tianxia lost its meaning until it is now being offered again by Zhao as a Confucian alternative to nation-state, sovereignty, and empire, and at the same time as the basis of a new peaceful world order. The second alternative concept of being in the world, developed by Arendt, also offers itself as a philosophically influenced alternative. Its existential philosophical basis not only deals critically with the individual in modernity, but also with the human condition of plurality. Arendt's alternative to nation-state, sovereignty and empire does not draw on a pre-modern tradition. And by rejecting the individualism of modernity and emphasizing interpersonal relationships, the famous in-between in Arendt's characterization of political phenomena, Arendt's intersubjectivity shows similarities with Zhou's concept of relational rationality. Zhou offers his concept of Tianxia as an alternative to a world which, in his opinion, is in a state of chaos at the time of recent globalization, where there are not only failed states, but a failed world overall, shaken by economic and financial, as well as political and ecological crises. This failed world cannot be transformed into a good world by nation-states, an empire and their egoism, as well as lust for power, but only, according to Zhou, by a complete change of perspective. This consists in the complete integration of all states and peoples in cooperation between them through a real-world policy in which there is no longer an internal or external dimension, and world problems are no longer viewed from national perspectives. This vision replaces United Nations, which according to Zhou is only agora and not polis, and a political philosophy which, citing him, only studies erroneous human behavior. Such research is necessary, but it fails to explore the fundamental problems in politics, says Zhou. Politics that identifies the enemy, from Hobbes to Carl Schmitt and Huntington, is actually a negative politics, whereas to turn enemies into friends is truly meaningful politics. However, those who have not thought in this nation-state and sovereignty tradition, a number of theorists, such as Althusius, Leibniz and Arendt, are not mentioned. What is to replace the UN in Zhou thinking is also not worthy of further thought, although Zhou generally recognizes the need for institutional arrangements. The fact that there are transnational structures and initiatives is not mentioned. Think of international organizations and peace missions of legal developments, or legal developments such as Raphael Lemkin's groundbreaking definition of genocide, etc. As an alternative, the author offers a traditional ruling structure of the good order between heaven and earth, which geographically encompasses all land, socio-psychologically all human hearts, and politically a world system. In this good order, according to the historical example, one country had control over all other countries, which however enjoyed a strong degree of autonomy. The Tianxia, that Zhou describes for our time, is characterized by its network character. This is its unlimited possibility of expansion in the form of voluntary membership. This is ultimately intended to achieve the goal of turning enemies into friends. An internationalization of world politics would bring Agora and Tianxia together so that Greek and Chinese tradition meet in harmony, according to Zhou. And the form of government would also converge, merge or reorganize. In an exchange of letters with the French intellectual Régis Debray, Zhou writes, "A globalization deepens the different political systems will become more and more similar, both dictatorships and democracies, only to end up evolving together towards a bastard political system or a new political system that does not yet have a name." Finally, for Zhou, Tianxia is based on a Confucian improvement and benefit that all parties involved derive from a cooperative and non-competitive activity. Zhou remarks that a political institution is transposed from superior to inferior levels, rather than vice versa. Vice versa, on the other hand, means that the indispensable values of Confucianism move from the family upward to the state, so that all under heaven is equally filled from top to bottom by a political principle and from bottom to top by a political meta principle. Therefore, in the end, Tianxia and the social institutions of the family are even isomorphs. Politics and morality interpenetrate each other. So this is a short, I will come back to some other positions of Zhou, but continue but we all know Hannah Arendt's position very shortly. The concept of all under heaven shows some similarities to Arendt's concept of being in the world. I do not need to go into Arendt's juxtaposition of earth and worldliness and worldlessness here. Both reject the modern cogito ergo sum as a starting point of an individualistic world oriented towards the subject. Arendt bases her political philosophy on the world-forming power of interpersonal relations, while Zhao similarly emphasizes the importance of relational rationality. In Arendt, one finds a double existential philosophical foundation of interpersonal relations. On the one hand, the human condition of being in the world. On the other hand, the active perception of human plurality, which Arendt calls second birth. Zhao, on the other hand, justifies interpersonal relations with a simple orientation towards Confucian ethics. Both Zhao and Arendt agree in their critique of the liberal world with its concept of individualism, nation-states, sovereignty, and empire, and both search for alternatives. But while Arendt sketches the image of the worldliness of the polis with its power-sharing and federal structures developed by Montesquieu, the institutional question in Zhao's All Under Heaven, strangely enough, not only remains unanswered, but is not even addressed. And while for Arendt, Montesquieu and the Federalists are theorists and practitioners of the institutionalization of building a world, for Zhao they are only the theorists of the chaotic world. Conversely, however, Arendt rejects any ethical foundation and makes a clear separation of morality and politics due to a series of negative experiences in Europe, ranging from Savonarola and Robespierre to moral-based ideological worldviews. A discussion appropriate to the subject and the contemporary challenges should address the following aspects of Zhao's thinking from the perspective of being in the world. Very shortly, some points I think I hold for important to discuss Zhao's position. The role of criticism, the phenomenon of plurality, the concept of human rights, and the importance of institutions. It is not, of course, a question of dealing with Zhao's thesis in general, but rather with their plausibility with regard to a new world order. So why criticism? Because it is indispensable with regard to one's own thought process, checks plausibilities and anticipates possible objections. It is also an integral part of communication, of relational rationality. But Zhao contrasts Kant's critique with traditional Chinese metaphysics, which emphasizes change and transformation, but does not emphasize opposition or contradiction. Yin and Yang are connected in contemporary harmony and not in oppositional contradictions. This is not only a philosophical difference, but a cultural one, which requires its own far-reaching discussion. The second aspect, the phenomenon of plurality, reveals the differences between Zhao's relational rationality and Arendt's intersubjectivism, despite all the similarities between Zhao's and Arendt's criticism of modern subjectivism. While Zhao's emphasis on the primacy of coexistence over existence means a Confucian attachment of individuals to the community, Arendt assumes a reciprocal relationship between individuals, which, due to their equally existing sameness and difference, expresses both the possibility of understanding and difference. Arendt's characterization of an anthropological plurality precedes the cultural forms of bonding. How much coexistence precedes existence, how much conformism, moral rules and authority, and how much free agreement and individual responsibility exist depends on the respective historical conditions of politics and power. Arendt's concept of intersubjectivity aims at enabling action, the possibility of free formation of majority and power control, and personal responsibility. In a democratic differentiating world, the image of the good ruler, according to Confucianism, morally good community is no longer a realistic goal to strive for in order to guarantee a life in a good political community. The alternative, both to a liberal world and to a romantic-looking world of all under heaven, is the Republic, based on a vast civil society which is vertical moral, without a vertical moral orientation from the family upwards to heaven, and without a political rule from heaven down to the family, but a horizontal space which is not subject to any heaven, but opens up a world in the form of pluralistic action. Plurality, in Arendt's case, a fundamental anthropological condition, takes the place of heaven. There is no justice determined by heaven and no justice of conflict resolution by the ruler, but the rule of law to which anyone, including officials, is subject. Finally, what is missing in Zhao's thesis of the world, what he calls a whirlpool of nations, which historically have striven towards the Chinese center, is the problem of minority rights. Plurality or relational rationality also require appropriate institutional structures to realize them, without which cannot be nation states and sovereign, but are most sensibly conceivable as federal structures. From this perspective, the Euphonios remarks on world peace and the peacefulness of the concept of all under heaven do not necessarily inspire confidence, since there is no concept of freedom that goes hand in hand with that of plurality and cannot be given to the good ruler, the community, or a certain majority. This brings us to the third aspect, human rights, which Zhao mentions and criticizes. According to a theory of the primacy of the community over the individual, social obligations take precedence over the individual rights. Citing him, it is clear that obligations justify the legitimacy of rights, so that obligations are above rights. Only committing ourselves to our obligations and therefore making our rights justified, we could be justified in asking the obligations of the others to respect our rights. Obligations are normatively prior to rights because of the simple reason that people only want rights and try to avoid obligations by nature. One could easily overlook the following sentence, which simply excludes human rights for criminals. Human rights could be made an unjust excuse for criminals who wish to free themselves of their deserved punishment. Consequently, Zhao describes this concept as that of so-called credit human rights, which makes human rights a matter of negotiation. They are granted to all in advance, and all must then prove themselves worthy of them in the fulfillment of their obligations. So the next point is going a little bit to other alternatives, and the road to the Republic, if you think of a Republican alternative, is difficult. Zhao's theses are not alone in China's debate about the political future, but since China's economic and, to a limited extent, intellectual liberalization and the toleration of Confucianism, they have been competing besides the Confucian current with three other intellectual currents of the post-Mao era: the liberal, the new left, and finally the authoritarian one, the latter oriented towards Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss. They are all united by a political orientation towards state sovereignty and authority, as well as nationalism for the cohesion of the multi-ethnic country at home and the demonstration of strength to the outside world. Therefore, there is no problem with overlaps. For example, when new leftists use Schmitt's distinction between friend and foe and the state of emergency, or when former followers of Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre now discover the topicality of Schmitt and Strauss for themselves. The majority of Schmitt's publications were not translated into Chinese by an unnamed translator, but by the well-known professor of law Tianxia, who calls himself a conservative socialist. He is a government advisor on Hong Kong issues and follows the narrative China stood up under Mao, got rich under Deng Xiaoping, and is now becoming a powerful under Xi Jinping. Finally, Strauss is attractive because he not only places the philosopher at the side of the ruler, which is reminiscent of the importance of the intellectual elite in Confucianism, but also helps to overcome the narrowness of academic life. Finally, Confucianism can easily be used as a unifying force of right and left. In China, it is not uncommon to talk about forms of a transition, where either Confucianism promotes a hybrid system or Carl Schmitt's politicized constitution is intended to assist in a transition from an authoritarian to a democratic form of government. Zhao's plea that Tianxia turns enemies into friends sounds like an indirect criticism of the Chinese Schmitt fever. In comparison, Republican ideas and Arendt's thinking are of much less importance in China. The theorists of a democratized Confucianism do not address the conflict between morality and judgment. It is only about ethical action, virtues such as courage, justice, the appropriateness of action, and good governance. The theorist of this Confucianism, Joseph Chan, points to the strong social cohesion of Confucianism and explains that virtue is indispensable for the stability of society and cannot be replaced by legalism, punishment, or reward. Chan agrees with other theorists in their criticism of liberalism that democracy, with its universal suffrage with regard to fluctuating moods, is a major actor of insecurity, so that Confucianism, and at the same time the good ruler, as well as corresponding constitutional bodies, should keep the people in check. This problem, which has been known since Plato, has given rise in the West since ancient times to various types of mixed constitutions, which limits the power of the people's representatives, but also of the governments and the judiciary. Quite unlike the Confucian reformers, Arendt did not rely on the good ruler, but on the contrary, on the federally linked and interlocked small units of political participation, as well as on forms of organization, such as councils and civil society. This is not a romanticized council movement, but it is rather about forms of organization through which citizens get easy access to political action, do not succumb to the vagaries of the masses in their judgments, and in case of doubt, stand up for humanity. This being in the world with its institutions is not a gift of some participation, but a framework of existential self-organization. Reformist Confucianism in China seeks to give Confucianism a special institutional weight in form of a meritocracy, thereby keeping democracy in check. Among a number of different proposals, Jiangxing's idea are currently the most advanced, proposing a three-chamber system consisting of the People's Chamber, the Chamber of Scholars elected from within its own ranks, and the House of Nations of cultural meritocrats. Laws are passed by two of the three chambers. The second has the right to veto. It is conceivable that an academy could be added, through which all senior civil servants pass, and whose chairman is a monarch, but with only symbolic power. The majority of numerous Confucian considerations of this style amount to a mixture of democracy and aristocracy. The peculiarity of Arendt's republicanism is that it refuses to accept the assumption of a fixed ethical moral cohesiveness of society, that it does not accept the supposed relief of the capacity for judgment because it has experienced its failure. The alternative that Arendt points out, namely to understand moral norms as mere opinions and to make the strength of a community dependent on civic commitment, is also a challenge for Western friends of republicanism. But in fact, Arendt also mentions an elite not as an organized and institutionalized social group, but as a form of agreement in both political and aesthetic judgment, what Arendt calls the discovery of who belongs together in the world, and the revelation in the pluralistic action of who someone is, that is, of what the political, the acting, and the speaking is concerned with, rather than what somebody is, according to his or her talents and professional abilities. This belonging together is, according to Arendt, an essentially aristocratic principle of organization, but it has nothing to do with an aristocratic organization with professional, moral judges, because sooner or later they would suffer a professional deformation and move away from the open polis. Let us look briefly at some Republican hints in China. Two institutional only to show I was looking for, is there some sort of elements or some Republican tradition in China? And it's difficult to find something, but there are two Chinese examples, and I would also mention two Chinese writers. The first example of Republican institutions, only to get an idea about how far it was or not far it was developed, can be found in the Southern Song dynasty in our times of Middle Ages, in the form of a rule based not on a bureaucracy committed to monistic principles, but on a large number of associations and intermediary bodies. The dynasty was obliged to involve the wise men in deliberations and decision-making. The common good was defined by the law-like principle Li, which was not subject to the will of individuals or of the ruler, but to which, on the contrary, all had to submit. This structure can be compared to the Kantian republicanism of ideas and Madison's extended republic, which enabled political participation over a large territory with the help of federal structures and moved between a loose federation and a modern hierarchical state. In this example, we find an anti-despotic thinking of an unusual elite, which noteworthy did not come from a hereditary nobility, but thanks to the open system of selection from wide circles of the population. However, this elite had no power and did not move within a democratic structure. So the term Republican does not mean much more than not despotic, subject to the principles Li, consultative, and the freedom of thought of the wise. The second example of some hidden Republican tradition is the thinking of Wang Zhongqi in the 17th century. He criticized the authoritarian and centralist exercise of power by the court in a time of severe political crisis and formulated strong reform proposals, especially concerning the institutions in his work Waiting for the Dawn. He did not want to eliminate the good regents, but he did want to limit their actions by laws. And although he did not undervalue the virtues, he wanted to support them by institutional order. We would call this type of government constitutional monarchy rather than republic. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Chinese reformers drew on the teaching of Wang. The Republican aspect of these reform proposals is the institutionalization of power control and at the same time the Confucian training of officials. But while the Confucian virtues know no difference between public and private and see the public sphere embedded in a hierarchical order, the Western Republican virtues are oriented towards the public sphere and have a rather low regard for the private sphere. Arendt's republicanism is radically horizontal. It contrasts the good and bad ruler, or even the bureaucratic rule of the nobody, with the actors of the polis, the hierarchies of power, with the power of the actors and the political equality in the public sphere, the authority of the office, with the authority of the actors and the canon of ethical behavior, or conformism, with independent intersubjective judgment. The second point I would like to mention, besides the hidden Republican tradition, deals with personalism, a European, above all French discussion in the middle of the 20th century about the role of the person in culture and politics. In Arendt, we find this in her general exploration into the phenomena of action and represented in portraits in her volume Men in Dark Times. In China, we find in the Chinese writer Lu Xun a strong critic of Confucian tradition as an intensive process of education and self-education, reminiscent of the European education of princes. At the beginning of the 20th century, he criticized Confucian feudalism, while at the same time directing his enlightened thinking against an unreflected modernization, influenced by the West in order to save the subjects from the masses and the individual from the collective. When the masses rule, according to Lu Xun, there is no force other than oneself that can save us. Another example is given by the intellectual and politician Tianxia. Zhang dealt with the problems of the Republic from a political theoretical point of view, initially mainly with the rules of law and republican institutions. Later he dealt with the problem of political change in China and the interaction between the people and the institutions. Given the social situation of the population, he considered the internal development of the people to be the first step and an indispensable prerequisite for any social action. This first step of an inner self-awareness enables talented people to act virtuously and exemplarily in institutions and social movements. Zhang thus relied on a republican personalism that is not subject to any regular Confucianism or Confucianism based on political hierarchy. However, he did not rely on joint, spontaneous actions in social movements. In a feudal society, his republicanism relied on the education of individuals through teaching and through experience, not through experience and judgment, as a necessary prerequisite for later political action. So to finish some ideas and recommendations. This short overview about contemporary thinking in Asia, especially in China, reveals some shortcomings and challenges. Shortcomings in the Western perception of the East, which is left until today to departments of Asian culture, and challenges with regard to political philosophy, maybe cosmopolitan, maybe transcultural activities and meetings, how to talk together among the cultures and the political spheres. To summarize, firstly, it can be said that the Republican citizen tradition in China is weak, while an apolitical Confucianism as well as a nation-state tradition of political thought are strong. Secondly, at the same time, it also becomes clear by the confrontation with Confucianism how radical Arendt's rejection of domination and political ethics is, trusting alone in action and judgment, claiming that this is the only way to fully develop plurality, worldliness, and institutional strength. Thirdly, the criticism presented here is not intended to counter the Confucian cultures of Asia with a Western republicanism, but rather to invite to criticize Western liberalism and Eastern authoritarianism, both of which are imbued with the concept of national sovereignty. It would then turn out that Arendt, in her pluralistic and essayistic thinking, can create something like a space between East and West. And fourthly, I would love to organize a European Asian conference on politics and ethics, Confucianism and republicanism, to talk about the common and the differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfgang. We are looking forward to listen to this conference already. I think. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, which actually goes into the direction that I very much wanted to go, the discussion about the concepts, namely about how the translation of concepts, how concepts are appropriated by translation actually among the different political systems, theories, and cultures, etc. So, and I think it was really fruitful. It was excellent to listen to this. So, who wants to talk? Ringo from the Zoom. Okay.
Yeah, shall I start?
Wait, let me see. Let me collect if there are others who want to talk. Anyone else here? I'm just looking at. No one else in the Zoom? Okay, then we have Tony. Nikita? No? 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 Okay, we have Ringo and Tony for now. Then we'll see if this will initiate some more discussion. Then we will continue also with others. So you can start, Ringo.
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang, for this impressive talk. I just was wondering if it could be an advantage to read the lectures on Laozi from Blücher, because Laozi is kind of the other part of the Chinese thinking on the political. It's more pacifist, it's more rejecting ideas that there is an overwhelming heaven or things like that. So it's, in Blücher's interpretation, Laozi is the more or less intersubjective thinker, and who rejects all confusions, terms and things like that. Maybe it could be fruitful to read them, just to have another idea of things which was going on in China. That was it.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is wonderful idea to see if the Taoism has in some other way in places, perhaps today. So I never thought about reading Blücher for this. So I'm very familiar with, not so familiar, but always kept an eye on Blücher, but not thinking that he could contribute something. Thank you. This is very good.
For those who eventually don't know, Heinrich Blücher was Hannah Arendt's second husband, and the intellectual exchange between them was very important for her. Okay, then we have Tony.
Wolfgang, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I really enjoyed reading the paper and listening to you. I have one question that's actually more like a suggestion, because I want to enter this, kind of engage you on this. And I also have two questions with that, but they're really straightforward. There's nothing much to them. Do you know, because you're talking about, and I really appreciated your paper and how related to international politics it is. Did you read, or do you know of the Ya-Qing Kin's relational theory of world politics? And if you do, I wanted to ask you what you thought of it, because it's a really big book now in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I suggest in that case, because it's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I have two just quick questions. What do you mean by relational rationality? And also, do you think that Arendt's ontological plurality can also be relational? Because I don't, for example, take Arendt as an interactionist thinker where individuals interact because of our plurality, but I take her more so as a thinker, as an existentialist in a way thinker, because for her, we are related through plurality without even having to interact. So I just wanted to get an answer on those. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The relational rationality is Zhao's interpretation of that we are belonging together, and he has in Confucian thinking of hierarchy and the predominance. The first existence is a coexistence with others. It sounds a little bit like Arendt when he says when we are doing something, we are living, put, not thrown, but like thrown into a community. We start to exist in a community, so we cannot think about the individual, first the individual, and then there are others, but our growing up, our existence is in a community. And when he says there's a coexistence before the existence, it means this. And the relational rationality means that thinking and all rational judgment and so has to do with these relations, in this thought in relation with others. So therefore, also this human rights interpretation that the human rights is not something what the individual has and protects, but that the human rights are something which are given by the community, and you have to show that you are worth of these human rights. And when you behave in a false way, then you lose yourself, your possibility to have human rights. No? And in Arendt is not the coexistence predominant, but I think my interpretation there's an equal balance between the subject and the intersubjectivity. We are subjects, but political phenomena like freedom, like action, and authority, and whatever comes up between us in the plurality. So the plurality is a form of our existence, or the form of existence of subjects, of the individuals. Therefore, I would do it more in the balance, and therefore it's also not the ethic predominant, but our judgment in the common. The judgment is in the plurality with the imagination of other positions and so on. So therefore, I would see similarities and differences between both.
Okay, thank you so much. We have now one more question or comment, which is Helgard.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating paper, Wolfgang. I have one commentary and one question. My question is, could you elaborate a bit upon what kind of political principle is it a specific political principle of this Confucianism, which you mentioned, and that should go from the bottom to the top, and then a political meta principle, what that is?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I have the impression that this is something like a codex of politics, which is there, organized by Confucian thinkers. And this is what comes from the heaven. So therefore, there's a general understanding, a little bit like our understanding. I don't know if you can compare it like this, that we have basic human rights and understanding of what is freedom, of humanity, of humanism, and so on. Something like this is the basic, which comes from the heaven, and a good order of society is the coexistence or the adequacy, or what, how do you say, that it works well together, heaven and earth. Earth is where the people are and the kings are. The kings have to rule according to what heaven's, the general principle says. This is like a little bit a metaphysical idea of what is right and what is wrong. So there's a world order. The world order is the heaven, and the rulers have to be in accordance with these rules and rule the people, and the people have to learn what is right and what is wrong with Confucian values. So that there's a unity. It sounds very, very well. It's a good society. The problem is who rules the society, who defines what is good, how much plurality do you have, and so on.
Yeah, thank you. And my commentary would be, I get the impression that there is a strong unwillingness to think in a positive way about the people. I even noticed it. Just give a very brief example. I reviewed a book, which the review will come out this year. 10 articles of Hannah Arendt are translated into Norwegian. And the introduction is written by a very well-known man here in the country. And he gives 2 sentences, very, very critical sentences, concerning the councils and Arendt's positive attitude to the councils. By saying to the audience, I mean the people who are going to read this book here in Norway, by telling them that he can definitely not understand how this wonderful, impressive theoretician of totalitarianism analysis can have such a romantic attitude towards the councils with a background of the Soviets and what has happened under Stalin. So it seems to me as if there is also among intellectuals who understand themselves as liberal or on the left liberal side, in unwillingness to give credit to the people that they can somehow become political actors.
Yeah.
But that's more a commentary.
Yeah. But I think it's a very important point in general in political science, in our politics, and also in Arendt, which should be more discussed, I think. I compare sometimes Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt. Both has the same age. They are Jews in exile from Germany, dealing with Weimar Republic, saying this sort of liberal representation is not enough, not strong enough to defend democracy. So there must be something other, something additional. This is republicanism. Leo Strauss goes to the polis, Hannah Arendt also, and develops more political theory. And then everything is very parallel and very the same. Then is the divide. Arendt goes to the people, and Leo Strauss goes with the philosopher to the ruler. It says the philosopher tells the truth to the ruler, and the people, they have their religion, they have their parties, and so this is not, they are happy with this. Don't tell them the truth. And Hannah Arendt makes an alternative. I think it's amazing when you think after the totalitarianism experience to think, and also seeing what in Germany was the restoration and so democracy, which was not yet fully accepted and practiced and so on, that she goes to the people. And my thesis would be that small units like these councils, what is not the council of only of the revolution, but we also have so-called councils in the German administration. So there's local institutional councils, and you can take the civil society as spontaneous councils altogether. So I think when there are smaller groups together, they don't feel lost in the political system, but they can participate, they can act, and so on. I think in this lies the strength, the hope and the strength of Arendt. You are right that others, like the founding fathers, were skeptical with the people. They said, can we organize to limit the power of the parliament and of the voters? So we made this electoral college, and so we organized several steps to moderate the hate, the rage, the irrationality of the people, because they had political practice experience. The French revolutionaries not. And therefore what I found out, because I was thinking, what is the relationship between Arendt and Confucianism, the role of ethics in society? We had, since years, we have some sort of discussion in social sciences about what is the cohesion in the society? How do we organize that the parts don't fall apart, of the society? This is a question of what? Of ethics, of moral, of habits. And Bourdieu studied the habits of society, which our behavior is very much organized by habits, which make it easier to live together, not to think always, not to judge the whole day, how do I behave, and so. But this is dangerous at the same time. And for Arendt, I think, to this phrase I used here, that there is no ethics for politics in Arendt, and in judgment there's a full action and the deliberation between people. And moral is nothing more than opinion, and judgment must be a judgment free of opinion, of prejudges, wrong judges or good or whatever. So this is can we think that this is reasonable and realistic? Arendt says yes, with the small units of organization, much participation, which could be something like strong politics, that many people are acting in their range, in their local regions.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helga and Wolfgang. I would also have a question, but if I may, I would make a little comment on what Helga actually said, because I didn't hear it like that. If I heard you right, you were somehow suggesting that yesterday's discussion here was like, not appreciating the people enough, or am I wrong?
A question to me?
Yeah, because what you said, did you say that we were not appreciating enough in our discussions the people, or no? It was just about Norway.
Yeah, yes, it was about it's my impression also in discussions
from yesterday.
No, from Norway, and also in relation to Wolfgang's paper, because it is as if the leaders somehow have to protect the system or their power against the people, so they have no positive view.
No, that's okay. I just thought that you.
It's the discussion yesterday. No.
Yeah, okay, that's all right. So I have a question for Wolfgang, which is very specific. I don't know if you can answer it, if you really went into the details, but what I'm really interested in, because I know that Carl Schmitt was, I mean, thinking actually, and his way that his thought was used, for example, to write Israel's constitution after. Yes. So it's very interesting, you know, this influence of Carl Schmitt all around the world, and it's quite and it's very, of course, it's totally contradictory, you know, that the first very important law theoretician of the Third Reich was influencing Israeli constitution. And now when you spoke about this translation, the use of Carl Schmitt in contemporary China, and then you used one text where 3 authors I see here in a footnote. So it's like Shelley Bean, Hayek, Patapan, 2 authors, Schmitt fever, the use and abuse of Carl Schmitt in contemporary China. And I'm really wondering, you know, what is their argument, you know, and what kind of abuse is this in their opinion, you know, but how much is it in translation, etc., etc. So how do you see this? Of course, if you went into more details in this, maybe.
Yeah, okay, this is a volume. I didn't read all the text there, and I read more about, how do you say, reviews of this book.
Mm-hmm.
This is like in many conferences, so the title is more promising than the essays in it. And I used another book, which is also in the footnotes, which I don't have here now. This is about the transition, the Mao Zedong, Carl Schmitt, Mao Zedong, and the question of transition. This is a book of a Chinese professor. She is teaching in Shanghai, publishing in London or in England. Her book that Mao Zedong is not helpful for the transition to some sort of non-authoritarian government. She doesn't write democracy, but non-authoritarian government. But Carl Schmitt is more interesting because he politicizes the legislation, the foundation, the constitution, the elaboration of the constitution. And this is possible, and for this I contacted a sinologist in Germany and said, this is possible that somebody who is talking about transition from an authoritarian government, which is the Chinese government, to another form of government. Is it possible that somebody is teaching there and publishing in England this? And he said, yes, this is all possible, so long as you don't criticize openly and have alternatives to the government, to the Communist Party.
This is also what last year's participant from China said here when we talked, when she was talking. Do you remember this?
Yeah, okay. So I don't have an answer to the abuses of Carl Schmitt. So
I would just like to have, if there is nothing else, I would just like to have one comment. I mean, and just pay a little attention to this, because you mentioned, you know, that the criminals are excluded within this framework of Zhao. They're excluded from human rights. I would just like to comment, because we've been working on this huge project on immigration at the Peace Institute, that actually, I mean, the criminals are excluded from human rights in the United States and in many European states as well, so they don't have the voting rights. The voting rights are taken from them either only for the time when they're in prison, and for some of them even for a longer time or for good. So this is not non-European invention or non-Western invention. So we have this, and this is how the concept of immigration was actually put into place, because the main theoretician who invented the term immigration actually started to make parallels between, you know, how the criminals, especially in the United States, were treated and how the migrants were treated, you know, and that this position when they are without human rights, basically that human rights are taken from them.
Yeah, this is very good, because I thought this case of Zhao, I mean, these texts of this type, more historically and so on, are dealt until today mostly in Chinese and Asian departments at universities. I have the impression that with Zhao enters now, he is writing since 2008 more or less about these topics in several articles in English which I could use. There are other things I cannot read because they are in Chinese. I think that since obviously modernization and also the expansion of China now, there are a lot of well-educated scientists. And in the distinction to Latin America, for example, where a good scientist reads what we call the menu at the bookshop. We sell Foucault, Rancière, Badiou, Papa, Nancy, Agamben, all this. This is your complete orientation intellectually to Europe. And I have the impression that the Chinese intellectuals don't have the need to orient to go to the West. Some, yes, liberals or New Left or whatever. But there's a lot of self-confidence of developing own positions. Many students are abroad. They come back, they are writing so that in the next years and decades we will have very well elaborated contributions to whatever philosophical, political problems. And it would be wonderful, I think, when you say, oh no, the challenges for us, what we don't discuss, what we don't critically adopt about our Republican, liberal, whatever system. There will be a lot of discussion and criticism coming from China, for example, and it is a good chance for us to rethink what we are doing often, but more to rethink the basis of our politics and the constitution, for example, about human rights, dealing with human rights, with refugees and so on, in a discussion with the Asians together. Therefore, my idea to have a conference.
Okay, Yanea.
Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang. I have just one question. Do you think that Republicanism as political thought is underrepresented in contemporary political philosophy, contemporary political theory?
I think it has its own place. When you see successfully publishing authors like Philippe Petit and others. So there's a lot of discussion about Republicanism. But I was looking at his work to find some help in the discussion about ethics, politics. So he doesn't mention this. It's not his topic. His topic is the rule of law and the activity of the people and so on. We have to define also what republicanism is. There are several interpretations of this. We have, I think, mixed governments here with the French tradition of the people, the sovereignty of the people, and the United States tradition of the republic. Things we have to discuss always anew. When I wrote criticism, there's Zhang's criticism or the Chinese criticism of liberalism, but they are speaking not of liberalism in general, but of the United States liberalism. When we talk about republicanism, what do we mean with this? So there's a lot of open discussion necessary in this context.